He bought an old barn for almost nothing, and everyone laughed. But no one knew what was hidden inside or where it would lead. When the truth began to surface, the laughter disappeared. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. An unexpected story is ahead. The wind moved across the fields before the sun rose, low and steady, brushing over dry soil and brittle grass, as if testing whether the land still had the strength to answer. The farmer stood near the edge of his property, boots planted firmly in the dirt, his hands resting on his hips while he stared at the horizon. Dawn came slowly here, not with beauty but with obligation. Another day meant another calculation, another quiet reckoning of what might break before nightfall. Behind him the old tractor sat motionless, its faded paint flaking like dead skin, a thin dark line of oil already spreading beneath the engine. He had noticed it before going to bed, and he knew it would be there in the morning. It always was. He bent down, wiped his fingers along the metal casing, and smelled the oil. The scent was sharp and familiar, the kind that clung to his clothes no matter how many times they were washed. He sighed and straightened, his back protesting with a dull ache that had long since stopped surprising him. The machine had carried him through more seasons than he could count, and now it was asking for more than he could afford to give. He ran through the numbers in his head without meaning to. The repair would cost more than last month's feed bill. The feed bill had already been paid late. The bank knew that. They always knew. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Still, he pulled it out, stared at the screen, and let it ring once more before answering. The voice on the other end was polite, practiced, and entirely indifferent. A reminder, nothing more. A reminder that the grace period was ending, that patience was not infinite, that land could be taken just as easily as it could be tilled. He responded with short, careful words, promising what he had promised before, knowing he would have to find a way to make it true. When the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood there for a moment longer, listening to the wind and the distant hum of a road that carried other people toward other lives. He was in his mid-40s, though the years showed more heavily on him than they did on most men his age. His hands were thick with calluses, the skin split and healed so many times it no longer remembered softness. Dirt lived permanently beneath his nails no matter how carefully he scrubbed them. His face, weathered by sun and cold, held lines carved not by laughter, but by concentration and restraint. He was not a man given to complaint. Complaining wasted breath, and breath was better saved for work. He had learned that early. The farm itself was modest, almost apologetic in its scale. A few acres of land that had once promised more than it delivered, a small house that leaned slightly as if tired of standing, and a scattering of outbuildings that told the story of years spent patching rather than replacing. Each season he told himself the same thing. Just make it through this one. Just don't lose the land. The soil might have been stubborn, but it was his, and that mattered in a way he could never fully explain. In town, people spoke his name with familiarity but without weight. He was the farmer who never quite caught up, the one whose equipment was always a generation behind, whose harvests were serviceable but unremarkable. Others had expanded, modernized, bought new machines that gleamed in the sun, and made efficiency look effortless. They talked about margins and investments over coffee at the diner, voices confident, laughter easy. He listened when he passed through, nodding politely, never joining the conversation. He had learned where he stood in the quiet hierarchy of the place, and he did not fight it. Fighting took energy, and energy was already spoken for. That afternoon, he drove into town with a short list in his head. He needed a replacement belt for the tractor, a can of oil, and a handful of bolts he hoped would fit an old piece of equipment that no longer had a serial number anyone recognized. The local auction was running that day, and while he had no intention of bidding on anything substantial, it was often the cheapest place to find odds and ends. He parked his truck on the edge of the lot and stepped out into the noise. The air smelled of dust, fuel, and burnt coffee. Men clustered in small groups, boots scuffing the ground as they talked. Someone laughed loudly, drawing attention to himself, and the sound carried easily. The farmer moved through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being overlooked. He examined a table of worn tools, testing their weight in his hands, calculating their usefulness. He bought a small box of mixed hardware for a few dollars and tucked it under his arm. That was when he heard it. The auctioneer's voice rose above the din, sharp and theatrical. All right, folks, last odd item of the day. Small red barn, outskirts of the county. $1 opening bid. Laughter rippled through the crowd almost immediately. Someone whistled. Someone else shouted a joke about a doghouse. The farmer paused, hardware box pressed against his ribs, and turned his head. A small red barn. He knew it. Everyone did in a vague way. It stood alone on a neglected patch of land near the edge of the county, too small to be useful, too intact to be dismissed entirely. He had passed it a dozen times over the years, never stopping, never thinking about it beyond a passing glance. It had always struck him as oddly neat for something so forgotten, its shape simple but deliberate, its roof still straight where others sagged. "Who'll give me $1?" the auctioneer called again, his grin wide as the laughter continued. The farmer felt something stir, faint but insistent. He couldn't have said what it was. Curiosity, perhaps, or the quiet voice of instinct he had learned to trust when logic offered nothing but dead ends. He stepped closer, ignoring the smirks that followed the announcement. "They're basically giving it away," someone said near him. "Must be rotten through." "Or haunted," another added to more laughter. The auctioneer looked out over the crowd, clearly expecting the moment to pass as a joke. "Any takers? $1. No takers." The farmer raised his hand before he could think better of it. The laughter faltered, then returned. Louder this time. Heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," the auctioneer said. "We got a bid." The farmer felt heat creep up his neck, but kept his hand raised. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the strange awareness that he had crossed an invisible line. He had spent years saying no to himself before anyone else could. This time, he hadn't. "No competition?" the auctioneer asked, glancing around. No one else raised a hand. Why would they? It was a dollar barn, a punchline, a curiosity at best. "Sold," the auctioneer said, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack. $1. The paperwork was brief and almost careless. A signature here, a receipt there. The farmer handed over a single bill, worn soft from passing through too many hands. The clerk slid a small envelope across the table. Inside it a key and a folded document that barely seemed to justify the transaction. Someone nearby chuckled as he took it. "Best investment you'll ever make," the man said, his tone thick with irony. The farmer did not respond. He tucked the envelope into his jacket and left the lot, the sound of laughter following him like dust on the wind. By the time he reached the barn, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The land around it was quiet, the road nearby empty. The structure stood as it always had. Red paint faded but not peeling, the door closed tight, a single small window catching the last of the light. Up close, it felt different. Solid. Present. He stepped closer, boots crunching softly on gravel, and reached out. His hand rested against the wood of the door, warm from the day. For a moment, nothing happened. Then faintly, unmistakably, he heard it. A dull, hollow sound, not the creak of old boards or the whistle of wind, but something deeper, as if the barn itself had answered his touch. He pulled his hand back, frowned, then pressed his palm against the door again. The sound came once more, low and resonant, like an echo from somewhere beneath the surface. The farmer stood there in the fading light, his breath slow and measured, the key heavy in his pocket. Whatever he had bought for $1 was no joke at all. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of pale gray dawn that slipped quietly over the land and revealed everything exactly as it had been left the night before. The farmer woke early, as he always did, the habit carved too deeply into him to be undone by curiosity or fatigue. For a brief moment, lying still and listening to the distant call of birds and the low hum of wind brushing past the house, he wondered if the sound he had heard at the barn had been nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on him. The mind, after all, had a way of inventing meaning when it was desperate for it, but the weight of the key in his pocket as he dressed told him otherwise. He felt it even through the thick fabric of his jacket, a small, solid reminder that the previous day had not been imagined. By the time he stepped outside, the sky had brightened just enough to cast long shadows across the ground. He paused on the porch, looking toward the distant line where the red barn stood apart from the rest of his property, and something tightened in his chest. Not fear, anticipation. He did not go there right away. There were animals to feed, water lines to check, and a tractor that still needed attention. Work, as always, came first. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, but his thoughts kept drifting. Every few minutes his gaze would lift toward the horizon, measuring the distance to the barn as if it might move when he wasn't looking. When he finally allowed himself to walk that way, the sun was already climbing, burning away the mist that clung stubbornly to the low ground. The road that cut past his land was busier than usual. Trucks rolled by, some slowing as they passed, their drivers glancing toward the barn with open curiosity. News traveled quickly in a small place like this, especially when it came wrapped in humor. He didn't need to hear the jokes to know they were being told. He could imagine them clearly enough. The man who bought a barn for $1, the fool who thought he'd beaten the system, the punchline that made everyone else feel just a little wiser by comparison. When he stopped at the feed store later that morning, the laughter found him anyway. It followed him through the door and lingered in the air like smoke. Someone nudged another man and nodded in his direction. The clerk grinned when he rang up the purchase, shaking his head slightly as if in disbelief. "Didn't know you were into collectibles now," the clerk said lightly. "That barn of yours is already famous." The farmer met his gaze and offered a neutral nod. "Just needed a place to store some things," he replied. "Well, for $1, I guess you can't complain," the clerk said, laughing again. The farmer took his receipt and left without another word. He had learned long ago that defending himself only fed the appetite of those who wanted to be entertained. Silence, while not respected, was at least efficient. By midday, he stood once more in front of the barn. In full daylight, it looked almost ordinary. The red paint was faded but intact, the boards straight, the roof solid and free of the sagging that plagued older structures. A single window sat high on one side, its glass dusty but unbroken. White trim framed the edges neatly, too neatly for something that was supposed to be forgotten. If he squinted, he could almost understand why others dismissed it. It was small, unimpressive. It did not announce secrets. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and carried the faint smell of old wood, clean rather than rotten. Light filtered in through the window, illuminating a simple interior. There was a narrow workbench against one wall, shelves above it, and enough open floor space to turn around without bumping into anything. It was exactly what it appeared to be, and yet the feeling from the night before had not faded. It lingered, quiet but insistent. He began a slow, methodical inspection, the way he approached everything. He checked the door hinges, tugging gently to test their strength. They held firm. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the grain of the wood, noting where boards met. When he knocked on one section, the sound was solid and dull. When he knocked a few inches to the side, the tone shifted, becoming slightly hollow. He frowned and knocked again, slower this time, listening carefully. The difference was subtle, but it was there. He crouched to examine the floor. The boards were worn smooth by time but well fitted, their edges tight. In one corner near the workbench, a plank caught his eye. Its color was only a shade darker than the others, the grain running in a slightly different direction. He pressed his foot against it. It did not move. He shifted his weight and tried again. Still nothing. If he hadn't been looking for irregularities, he might never have noticed it at all. Under the workbench, partly hidden in shadow, something metallic glinted faintly. He knelt and brushed aside a layer of dust, revealing a small, rusted fixture bolted into the floor. It looked like a latch, the kind used to secure heavy equipment or doors, though this one was flush with the wood and nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. He wrapped his fingers around it and pulled. It did not budge. He tried pushing instead, then twisting slightly. The metal resisted, stiff with age, but he felt the slightest give, a whisper of movement that told him it was not merely decorative. His pulse quickened. He released the latch and stood, taking a step back as if the barn might react to his curiosity. For several minutes he did nothing. He told himself the obvious explanations. Old fixtures were often reused. Farmers were practical people. Someone might have bolted down equipment there decades ago and left the hardware behind. There was no reason to assume anything more. And yet the sound from the night before returned to him, clear as if it were happening again. He pressed his palm against the door once more, listening. The hollow response answered him immediately, unchanged by daylight. He locked the barn and returned to his work, though his focus had begun to fray. Every task felt slower, his attention divided. When evening came, the sky clouded over, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. He ate a simple dinner and sat at the table longer than usual, staring at the grain of the wood beneath his hands. Outside, the first drops began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. It was the sound that drew him back out. Not the rain itself, but something beneath it. A faint, almost imperceptible click carried on the wind. He stood, heart thudding, and listened. There it was again. Short, metallic, wrong. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight and a few tools from a drawer, and stepped into the night. Rain darkened the ground, the smell of wet earth rising around him. The barn loomed ahead, its red walls muted under the overcast sky. He paused before unlocking the door, listening. Nothing. The click had vanished. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. Shadows leapt and settled as he moved, illuminating familiar shapes. He went straight to the workbench and crouched, shining the light on the latch. Water had seeped in through the cracks, beating on the metal. He wiped it away and gripped the fixture again, this time with a pair of pliers. He pulled. The latch resisted, then shifted slightly, enough to send a shiver up his arm. He adjusted his grip and tried again, applying steady pressure. The sound he heard then was unmistakable. A low, muted creak, not from the latch itself, but from the floor around it. He froze. Slowly, carefully, he placed the pliers on the bench and pressed his foot against the darker plank he had noticed earlier. It did not sink, but he felt something beneath it, a subtle give that had not been there before. He knelt and pressed down with both hands. The board responded with a soft, almost reluctant movement, lifting just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness beneath. Cold air seeped up through the gap, carrying with it a smell that was neither damp nor decayed, but clean and old, like a cellar that had been sealed away from time. The farmer sat back on his heels, rain still tapping against the roof above him, his flashlight beam fixed on the narrow opening at his feet. Whatever lay beneath the barn was real, and it was waiting. The farmer did not open the board that night. He knelt there for a long time instead, rain drumming steadily against the roof while the narrow crack in the floor breathed cold air against his hands. Every instinct he had warned him not to rush. Whatever waited beneath the barn had been hidden deliberately, and things hidden that well were not meant to be stumbled into carelessly. Eventually, he lowered the board back into place, returned the latch to its resting position as best he could, and stepped outside into the rain, locking the door behind him with a care that bordered on reverence. Sleep came late and shallow. His dreams were restless, filled with the sensation of descending stairs that never quite reached the bottom, of doors opening into spaces that defied shape and measure. When morning finally arrived, it did so under a pale, washed-out sky. The rain had passed, leaving the world damp and quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. He rose early, earlier than usual, his body already moving before his mind had fully caught up. Coffee went untouched on the table as he gathered what he would need: a length of sturdy rope, a second flashlight with fresh batteries, thick gloves, a small pry bar, a hammer, and a folding knife. He paused at the door, scanning the horizon out of habit, half expecting to see someone standing near the barn, watching. There was no one, only the land, still and indifferent. By the time he reached the barn, the light had improved enough that the red of the walls looked almost warm. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. The interior felt different now, charged with a presence he had not noticed before. He crossed the floor slowly, his boots echoing softly, and stopped at the workbench. The darker plank waited where he had left it, indistinguishable from the others unless you knew exactly what to look for. He worked carefully, methodically. First, he cleared the area, moving the bench just enough to give himself space. Then he gripped the latch with both hands and pulled. This time it yielded more easily, the metal giving a soft groan as it released. He slid the pry bar beneath the edge of the plank and levered it upward. The board lifted, revealing a rectangular opening framed by solid timber. Darkness yawned beneath his feet. He knelt and shone his flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the gloom and caught on something unexpected. Metal. Not rusted scraps or broken tools, but fixed rungs, evenly spaced, bolted into the wall like a ladder. Beyond them, the floor dropped away into a narrow vertical shaft. The air that rose from it was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of old wood and stone. He secured one end of the rope to a support beam above the opening and tested it twice before trusting his weight to it. Then, gripping the ladder, rungs with gloved hands, he began to descend. Each step took him farther from the familiar sounds of the farm above. The rain on the roof faded, the distant road disappeared. In their place came a deeper silence, broken only by the soft scrape of his boots against metal. The shaft was narrow but well constructed, its walls smooth and straight, the timber supports thick and unwarped. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. After several feet, his boots touched solid ground. He stepped off the ladder and turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight beam around him. He stood in a compact underground chamber, larger than he had expected, its ceiling high enough that he did not feel cramped. The walls were lined with wood paneling, aged but intact, and the floor beneath his feet was smooth and level. Built-in shelves ran along one side, empty but sturdy. Small vents near the ceiling suggested a ventilation system, cleverly concealed and still functional enough to keep the air fresh. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This was no root cellar, no makeshift hideaway. This space had been designed. He moved cautiously, inspecting every detail. The joints where the beams met were precise, the craftsmanship careful and deliberate. There was no sign of water damage, no mold, no rot. It was as if the room had been sealed away at the moment of its completion and left untouched ever since. His light fell on a wooden crate pushed neatly against the far wall. He knelt, brushed away dust, and lifted the lid. Inside lay tools. They were old but well-maintained, their metal surfaces coated in a thin layer of oil that had preserved them. Wrenches, chisels, a hand drill, measuring instruments he recognized only vaguely. Each had its place, arranged with a tidiness that spoke of discipline and pride. Beneath them lay a rolled bundle wrapped in heavy cloth. He unwrapped it carefully and felt his breath catch. Blueprints. The paper was yellowed with age but intact, the lines sharp and confident. He spread them out on the floor, weighing the corners with tools to keep them from curling. The drawings depicted structures, cross-sections, and mechanisms that made his head spin. This was not just a room beneath a barn, it was part of something larger, something ingenious. He recognized the outline of the barn above, but the interior told a different story. Hidden spaces, moving panels, structural elements designed to create far more room than the exterior suggested. At the bottom corner of one page, a name was written in careful block letters. He traced it with his finger, feeling the grooves pressed into the paper by a steady hand. Nearby, carved into one of the support beams, were the same initials, deeply etched, accompanied by a date that made his stomach tighten. Decades ago, the realization settled over him slowly, heavy, and undeniable. This place had not been built by accident. It was not the result of improvisation or thrift. It was a deliberate experiment, a proof of concept crafted by someone who believed that space could be created where none seemed to exist. As he studied the chamber further, he noticed something else. On the far wall, partly hidden behind a set of shelves, was a seam. It ran vertically, almost invisible unless the light hit it at the right angle. He stepped closer, ran his fingers along the wood, and felt the faint outline of a panel. His pulse quickened. He pressed gently, testing for movement. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a quiet click, the panel shifted inward a fraction of an inch. He applied more pressure, and the section of wall slid aside smoothly, revealing another space beyond. He stood there, stunned, staring into the darkness beyond the panel. The beam of his flashlight caught on a continuation of the floor, wider than the chamber he stood in, sloping gently downward. The air from within was even cooler, carrying the same clean, sealed scent. A laugh escaped him before he could stop it, short and incredulous. He had bought a barn for $1, and beneath it lay a structure that defied every expectation he had ever learned to carry. He climbed back up only when his legs began to tremble from the strain of standing. Securing the panel and the floor as best he could, he emerged into the barn above with his mind racing. The rain had washed the air clean, and sunlight now filtered through the window, illuminating the ordinary space as if nothing had changed. But everything had. That evening, as he sat alone at his kitchen table, the blueprints spread before him, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The barn was not simply hiding something valuable, it was hiding a story, and he had only just begun to uncover it. For the rest of that night, sleep barely touched him. The blueprints lay spread across the kitchen table, their yellowed pages catching the weak light of a single lamp. He studied them slowly, line by line, tracing measurements, angles, and symbols that meant little to him on their own, but together formed a logic he could feel even if he could not yet name it. The barn above was there on the drawings, its simple exterior sketched plainly, almost modestly. But beneath and within it, the plans revealed something else entirely. Layers, compartments, movable structures designed to transform space itself. By morning, his eyes burned from lack of rest, but his mind was sharp in a way it had not been for years. He returned to the barn as soon as his basic chores were done, locking the door behind him and lowering himself once more through the hidden opening in the floor. This time, the descent felt less like fear and more like anticipation. He moved with purpose, confident now that the ladder would hold him, that the air below was safe to breathe, that the darkness concealed intention rather than danger. The underground chamber greeted him with the same quiet solidity as before. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of his flashlight, undisturbed by time. He crossed the room directly to the hidden panel and pressed the spot he had discovered the night before. It slid aside smoothly, almost eagerly, as if relieved to finally be used again. He stepped through. The space beyond was larger than the first chamber, stretching farther than his light could immediately reveal. The floor sloped gently, guiding him forward, and the ceiling rose higher as he advanced, supported by thick beams set at careful intervals. He stopped and swept the flashlight slowly from wall to wall. What he saw made him shake his head in disbelief. This was no crude extension or storage pit. It was a fully realized workspace. Along one wall ran a long bench that folded out from the structure itself, its hinges heavy and precise. Above it, panels could be lifted to reveal rows of hooks, perfectly spaced for tools. On the opposite side, tall compartments were built into the wall, each with sliding doors that disappeared seamlessly into grooves when open. He pulled one open and found empty shelves reinforced with metal brackets strong enough to hold serious weight. In the center of the room, anchored into the floor, was a broad platform with recessed tracks along its edges. He knelt to inspect them and recognized their purpose instinctively. This was meant to support heavy machinery, perhaps even sections of farm equipment, allowing them to be moved or rotated without strain. Someone had designed this place with the hands of a working farmer in mind. He tested one of the mechanisms carefully. A lever hidden beneath the bench released a locking system with a dull clunk, and the platform shifted slightly under his touch, gliding along the tracks with a smoothness that felt almost unreal. He froze, half expecting the structure to fail, but it held firm. The engineering was sound, better than sound. It was elegant. For the first time in years, he felt a smile pull at his mouth, hesitant at first, then stronger. He imagined bringing down the broken tractor parts that cluttered his yard, lowering them carefully into this hidden space where he could work on them in warmth and quiet, shielded from weather and judgment alike. The thought sent a wave of relief through him, so sudden it nearly made him dizzy. He spent hours exploring, moving slowly, testing each discovery with respect. Folded tables unfolded into sturdy work surfaces. Narrow ladders slid out from walls, leading to upper storage spaces concealed above eye level. Ventilation shafts were cleverly hidden behind slatted panels, drawing fresh air from above without revealing their purpose from the outside. Every feature spoke of a mind obsessed not with show, but with function, efficiency, and dignity. Eventually, his attention returned to the documents he had found. He brought the blueprints down with him and spread them across one of the benches, comparing the drawings to the reality around him. Everything matched, every line, every measurement, and tucked between two pages, he found a folded letter he had missed before. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. It was written in a careful hand, addressed not to a person, but to an idea. The author spoke of building something small enough to be ignored and strong enough to endure, of creating spaces for people who worked with their hands, who could not afford grand structures but deserved intelligent ones. There was bitterness in the words, but also resolve. He read of investors who laughed, of officials who dismissed the project as impractical, of a prototype that was completed and then quietly abandoned when funding vanished. This barn, he realized, was that prototype. The weight of the discovery settled over him slowly. He was standing inside the discarded dream of someone who had seen farmers like him not as backward or expendable, but as worthy of innovation. Someone who had tried to change the way space was used, only to be pushed aside. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket. Then, as the light shifted above, he decided to test the space in the most practical way he knew. He returned to the surface, fetched a damaged tractor component that had sat untouched for months, and carried it down into the hidden workshop. The effort was heavy but manageable, and when he set the piece onto the central platform, it fit perfectly. He worked for the rest of the afternoon, absorbed in the task. Tools that had once been awkward to use in cramped sheds now felt natural in his hands. He adjusted the platform, rotated the part, accessed angles that had been impossible before. When he finally stepped back, wiping grease from his hands, the repair was complete. Something he had expected to take days or to require outside help he could not afford had been finished in hours. Above ground, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. A truck slowed as it passed his property, the driver's gaze lingering on the barn longer than necessary. Word was spreading, he knew. People noticed when routines changed, when broken machines began to run again. The next morning, a neighbor stopped at the fence, leaning casually as if he had business there. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward the barn. "Looks like you got that old tractor moving," the man said. "Didn't think it had it in it." "Found a way," the farmer replied simply. The neighbor nodded, curiosity sharpening his expression. "Funny thing, that barn. Didn't take you for the sentimental type." The farmer said nothing, but as the man walked away, he felt the first ripple of unease. Secrets had weight, and the more valuable they were, the heavier they became. That night he returned underground and stood once more in the expanded chamber, listening to the quiet hum of the ventilation, feeling the solid ground beneath his boots. He thought of the name carved into the beam, of the letter written by a man whose ideas had been buried along with this place. He thought of the laughter at the auction, the easy dismissal. Near the far wall, partly hidden behind a sliding compartment, his flashlight caught on something new. A small, reinforced door set low into the structure, its surface marked by a simple lock, heavier than any he had seen so far. He knelt, brushed away dust, and tested it gently. It did not move. Whatever lay behind that door had been sealed with intention. He sat back on his heels, the quiet around him thick with possibility. The barn was already more than anyone imagined, and he was certain now that it was not done revealing itself. From the moment the farmer locked the barn door behind him that night, he knew the quiet would not last. The land had a way of carrying change outward, like ripples across water. Even before anyone spoke to him directly, he could feel eyes where there had once been indifference. Trucks slowed more often on the road. Neighbors lingered at fences longer than necessary. Small, meaningless coincidences began to stack up in ways that were no longer meaningless at all. He did not change his routine. If anything, he became more deliberate about it. He rose at the same hour, fed the animals, worked the fields, and repaired equipment as he always had. But now each evening, he returned to the barn with a heightened awareness, checking the ground for disturbed gravel, listening for sounds that did not belong. The barn itself felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. What once seemed like a forgotten structure had become a boundary, and boundaries attracted pressure. The first attempt came disguised as friendliness. One afternoon, as he was unloading supplies from his truck, a neighbor wandered over with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The man leaned against the fence, arms crossed casually, and nodded toward the barn. "Strange little building," he said. "Heard you picked it up cheap." The farmer straightened, meeting his gaze without challenge. "That's right. Mind if I take a look inside sometime? The neighbor asked, chuckling, as if it were nothing more than idle curiosity. Just curious how a dollar barn looks on the inside. The farmer shook his head. Nothing to see. The neighbor laughed again, but there was a flicker of irritation beneath it. Fair enough, he said, pushing off the fence. Just thought I'd ask. He walked away, but the question lingered like a scent in the air. Others followed. A man he barely knew stopped by to ask if he had a spare tool. Another claimed he had lost something near the edge of the property and wanted to check the area around the barn. Each request was polite. Each refusal met with a smile that faded just a little too quickly. The farmer remained calm, answering briefly, never inviting anyone closer than necessary. He had learned long ago that once people were allowed to cross a line, they rarely respected where it was drawn. At night, the pressure sharpened. It began with small things. One evening, as he walked toward the barn with a lantern, he noticed a scuffed mark near the door, where the dirt had been smoothed unnaturally, as if someone had stood there too long. Another night, he found the lock slightly damp. Water beaded on it, though the rest of the door was dry. He tested it carefully. It held. But the message was clear. Someone had been there. He did not panic. Panic wasted energy. Instead, he acted. The next morning, he replaced the old lock with a heavier one and installed a simple alarm of his own design, a line of wire and small bells concealed near the doorframe. Nothing elaborate, nothing obvious, just enough to warn him if the door was touched. He marked the ground nearby with a pattern only he would recognize, subtle disturbances that would tell him if someone had approached again. That evening, after ensuring everything above ground was secure, he descended into the hidden workshop. The underground spaces welcomed him with their steady silence, the quiet hum of ventilation, a reassurance rather than a threat. He crossed to the reinforced door he had discovered the night before and knelt beside it, running his hand over its surface. The lock was old but solid, its mechanism complex in a way that suggested it protected something important. He worked slowly, carefully, dismantling the outer casing piece by piece. Hours passed without his noticing. When the final component gave way, the door opened with a muted click, revealing a shallow compartment lined with metal. Inside were documents. They were bundled neatly, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed against moisture. He lifted them out one by one, spreading them across the bench. Contracts, letters, diagrams, and photographs stared back at him, each piece adding weight to what he already suspected. These were not idle sketches or half-formed ideas. They were proof. Proof that the barn was the result of a funded project, however briefly that funding had lasted. Proof that it had been evaluated, tested, and deemed successful by those who mattered before being quietly abandoned. One document in particular held his attention. It outlined the transfer of ownership of the land on which the barn stood, the wording deliberately vague, the signatures hurried. A later note scrawled in the margin hinted at pressure from parties who wanted the structure forgotten. Buried, removed from consideration. He felt a slow burn of anger, not sharp or explosive, but deep and steady. Someone had decided that this place, this idea, and the man who created it were inconvenient, and rather than fight it, they had hidden it away, trusting time and neglect to do the rest. He gathered the documents carefully and secured them in a metal case he found beneath the compartment, locking it shut with a small key that had been tucked into the lining. When he finished, he sat back and let the reality of the situation settle over him. The barn was not just valuable in a practical sense. It was dangerous in the way truth often was. It threatened narratives that others had already decided were settled. The knock came 2 days later. The man who stood on his porch wore clean boots and a jacket that had never known honest dirt. His smile was professional, measured, and his eyes moved constantly, taking in details without appearing to do so. "I'm with the county," the man said, producing a card. "We've had a few questions raised about a recent property transfer." The farmer took the card, glanced at it, and handed it back. "Everything's legal." "I'm sure it is," the man replied smoothly. "But a sale for $1 tends to attract attention. We just need to verify a few things." "Like what?" "Like the intended use of the structure," the man said, "and whether it complies with zoning and safety regulations." The farmer nodded slowly. "You can file your request." The man's smile tightened. "It would be easier if you let me take a look now." The farmer met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "It won't be." For a moment something flickered in the man's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. He nodded once, stepped back, and tucked his card into the pocket of the farmer's jacket with a familiarity that felt deliberate. "We'll be in touch," and he said, and walked away. That night the bells rang. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft chime carried on the wind. The farmer was out of bed and moving before his mind had fully woken. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped outside. The night was clear, the stars sharp overhead. As he approached the barn, the bells chimed again, then fell silent. The ground near the door was disturbed, fresh. Someone had been there, testing the lock, retreating when it resisted. The farmer stood there in the dark for a long moment, listening. Whoever it was had already gone, but the message remained. Curiosity had turned into intent. He returned inside and sat at his kitchen table, the metal case of documents resting before him. He understood now that secrecy alone would not protect what he had found. Sooner or later, someone would try to take it, to claim it under some technicality or fabricated concern. If that happened in silence, he would lose. He had neither money nor influence to fight a quiet battle. But noise was different. As dawn crept in through the window, he made a decision. He would not hide. He would prepare. He would gather everything, every document, every mechanism, every proof of what the barn truly was. And when the time came, he would make sure that whatever happened next happened in the open, where it could not be undone with a signature and a shrug. Outside, the barn stood silent, its small red shape unassuming against the land. To anyone else, it was still a joke, a curiosity bought for $1. But to the farmer, it had become something else entirely, a line in the ground, and he had no intention of stepping back from it. The days that followed passed beneath a low, unbroken tension that settled into the farmer's bones like cold. Nothing overt happened at first. No trucks returned to his driveway. No letters arrived stamped with urgent warnings. And yet the sense of pressure never lifted. It lingered in the pauses between sounds, in the way the road seemed louder at night, in the fact that he now checked the barn's lock not once, but twice, every time he passed it. He had crossed a line, and the world beyond his fields had noticed. He knew fear well enough to recognize it, but this was not fear. It was vigilance, the kind that sharpened the senses instead of dulling them. Each morning he rose with the same discipline he had always possessed, but now his thoughts were ordered toward a single purpose. If someone intended to take the barn from him, they would have to do it in the light. He would not allow what had been hidden once to be buried again without a fight. He began by gathering everything, not in a rush, not with panic, but with care. Each evening after his work was done, he descended into the hidden spaces and photographed every mechanism, every sliding panel, every folded table and reinforced beam. He documented how the ventilation worked, how the platforms moved, how the weight was distributed so that the structure above gave no hint of the complexity beneath. He laid the blueprints out and photographed them page by page, then did the same with the letters and contracts from the sealed compartment. Dates, signatures, marginal notes, all captured and preserved. At night, seated at his kitchen table, he organized what he had collected. He was not a lawyer or an academic, but he understood patterns. The documents told a clear story when placed in the right order. A funded prototype, an evaluation period, positive internal assessments, then silence. The project had not failed, it had been abandoned. And that distinction mattered. The name carved into the beam beneath the barn became his next focus. He searched for it late into the night on his old laptop, the screen glowing faintly as the house around him slept. At first, nothing appeared, then fragments, a short mention in an archived local paper, a reference in a university newsletter from decades earlier. The man had been an architect, yes, but also something of an idealist. He had written about efficient design, about honoring labor through intelligent spaces. His ideas had been praised quietly and dismissed publicly. Too strange, too impractical, too ahead of their time. The farmer read everything he could find, feeling an unexpected kinship with a man he had never met. He recognized the tone of the writing, the stubborn hope tempered by realism. This architect had believed in people like him, People who worked with their hands and were expected to accept less without complaint. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely place. One afternoon, while buying feed in town, an older man struck up a conversation near the counter. His movements were slow, his back bent by years of labor, but his eyes were sharp. He glanced toward the farmer and then casually mentioned the barn. "Funny thing," the man said. "I remember when that was built." The farmer looked up, his attention fully engaged. "You do?" The man nodded. "Long time ago, folks said it was part of some experiment. A smart fellow came through, asking questions, measuring land. People laughed at him, said he was wasting his time." "Sworn, what happened to him?" the farmer asked. The old man shrugged. "World happened. Money dried up. People lost interest. Last I heard, he left town. Didn't stick around to be mocked." The words stayed with the farmer long after he returned home. This was the confirmation he needed. The barn was not a rumor or a coincidence. It had history, and history had witnesses. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was formal, printed on official letterhead, and brief. A notice of inspection. The county intended to assess the structure for compliance, citing concerns about unpermitted modifications and safety risks. The date was set for the following week. The farmer read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the table beside his growing stack of evidence. This was the moment he had been preparing for. Quiet resistance would no longer suffice. He needed someone whose authority did not rely on the same systems that had buried the barn in the first place. That evening, he made a call. The woman who answered spoke with a calm curiosity that immediately put him at ease. She was an architectural historian at a state university, someone whose work focused on overlooked designs and abandoned projects. He explained as much as he dared over the phone, careful not to sound exaggerated or desperate. When he mentioned a fully realized prototype hidden beneath a small agricultural structure, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I see it?" she asked simply. She arrived 2 days later, driving an unremarkable car and carrying nothing more than a notebook and a camera. The farmer led her to the barn without ceremony, unlocking the door and stepping aside as she entered. At first, she saw only what everyone else saw: the small space, the modest dimensions, the ordinary surfaces. She frowned slightly, clearly skeptical but polite. Then he showed her the latch. The moment the floor opened and the ladder was revealed, her expression changed. She descended carefully, her eyes widening with each step as the hidden chamber came into view. She moved slowly through the space, touching the walls, examining joints, testing mechanisms with the practiced confidence of someone who understood what she was seeing. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. He led her through each section, each hidden room, each ingenious solution. When she saw the blueprints and recognized the name carved into the beam, she went still. "I've read about him," she said softly. "He was dismissed as impractical. But this is brilliance." She spent hours documenting the structure, asking questions, taking notes, her excitement growing with every discovery. By the time they returned to the surface, the sun was setting, and the barn looked as small and unassuming as ever. But now it felt almost ironic. "This cannot be taken quietly," she said as she packed her things. "If they try, it won't hold." The day of the inspection arrived with a gathering that felt more like an audience than an assessment. 2 county officials arrived in clean trucks, accompanied by the man from before, the one with the practiced smile. Several neighbors stood at a distance, pretending to mind their own business while watching intently. The farmer greeted them calmly and handed over copies of the documents he had prepared. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply opened the barn door and invited them inside. When the floor opened and the truth of the structure revealed itself, the reactions were immediate and unguarded: surprise, confusion, disbelief. The officials exchanged looks, their confidence faltering as they descended into spaces they had not anticipated. The architectural historian stood nearby, explaining calmly, precisely what they were seeing. A prototype, a documented project, a historically significant structure. She spoke with authority, her words measured and undeniable. The man with the practiced smile said nothing. He watched, his expression tightening as the narrative shifted beyond his control. By the time they emerged, the tone had changed entirely. There would be no immediate action, they said. Further review would be required. Recommendations would be made. The farmer nodded, accepting their words without triumph. As the trucks pulled away and the neighbors dispersed, he stood alone once more beside the barn. The fight was not over, but it was no longer his alone. The truth had been seen, and once seen, it could not easily be forgotten. The waiting that followed was heavier than the confrontation itself. After the officials left and the neighbors drifted back to their routines, the farm settled into a deceptive calm. The fields still needed tending, the animals still required care, and the seasons showed no concern for disputes over ownership or legacy. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of rural life, something irreversible had begun. The barn was no longer invisible, and the farmer understood that whatever came next would shape not only his future, but the fate of what had been hidden there for decades. Weeks passed before the next letter arrived. This one was different, thicker. Official seals pressed into the envelope, signatures layered over one another. He opened it slowly at the kitchen table, the same place where he had once stared at auction papers, and wondered whether he had made the worst mistake of his life. The words were formal, cautious, but unmistakable in their meaning. The barn and its subterranean structure were being recognized as a historically significant architectural prototype. Any attempt to dismantle, seize, or alter it without oversight would be prohibited. Further evaluation would be conducted in cooperation with academic institutions and preservation boards. He read the letter twice, then a third time, letting the reality settle into him. The land was still his, the barn was still his, but now it carried a weight larger than ownership. It carried recognition. The changes came quietly at first. A car appeared at the edge of the road one morning, its occupants lingering too long before driving on. Then another. People began stopping him in town, asking careful questions, no longer laughing, no longer casual. Their tone had shifted from curiosity to respect, tinged with something like regret. He answered politely but briefly. He had learned that attention, like neglect, could be dangerous if handled carelessly. The architectural historian returned, this time accompanied by colleagues. They moved through the barn and its hidden spaces with reverence, speaking in hushed voices, marveling at details the farmer now knew by heart. They spoke of publications, of lectures, of the architect whose name had nearly vanished from memory. They spoke of how far ahead of his time the design had been, how it anticipated ideas only now being discussed seriously. The farmer listened, absorbing it all, but he remained grounded in what mattered most to him. This place had not saved him because it was clever. It had saved him because it was built with respect for the kind of life he lived. News traveled faster than he expected. A regional paper ran a story. Then another picked it up. Photographs appeared, carefully framed to show just enough to intrigue without revealing everything. The headline spoke of a forgotten design rediscovered on a small farm, of a structure dismissed for decades, now challenging assumptions about space and worth. The farmer read the article once, then folded the paper and set it aside. The words mattered less than the change he felt walking through his own land. The neighbors noticed it too. Those who had once slowed their trucks to stare now waved as they passed. A few stopped to speak, offering awkward congratulations or apologies they struggled to phrase properly. One admitted he had laughed at the auction. Another said he had assumed the farmer was desperate or foolish. The farmer accepted their words without bitterness. He knew how easy it was to judge what appeared small or strange. He had done it himself once, standing in front of the barn before he truly looked at it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in warm gold, he descended into the hidden workshop alone. He moved through the spaces without a flashlight now, every turn familiar, every mechanism understood. He paused beside the beam where the architect's name was carved, resting his hand against the wood. "I didn't know what you built," he said quietly, "but I'm glad I didn't walk away." The barn had not changed in size. It still stood modest and unremarkable against the land, its red paint weathered but sound. From the road it remained easy to overlook, but the farmer no longer saw it that way, and neither did the world. What had once been mocked as a foolish purchase had become proof of something deeper. That value was not always loud, that intelligence did not always announce itself, that sometimes the most important things were designed to be found only by those willing to look past the surface. He continued farming as he always had. He repaired equipment in the hidden workshop, stored harvests with an efficiency that once would have been impossible, and worked his land with renewed confidence. The barn did not make him rich. It did not turn his life into something unrecognizable. It simply gave him what he had never been offered before: stability, dignity, space enough to stand fully in his own life. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the fields and the barn stood silent under the stars, he knew the truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. He had not bought a mistake. He had uncovered a promise. One buried not just in wood and earth, but in the belief that even the smallest place could hold something extraordinary if given the chance to be seen. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next unbelievable story. Watch another shocking video on the channel right now and share this video with your friends. Someone else needs to see this too.